Early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders and scribes and the whole council, immediately held a consultation. And binding Jesus, they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. Pilate questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "It is as you say." The chief priests began to accuse him harshly. Then Pilate questioned him again, saying, "Do you not answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer. So Pilate was amazed. Now, we have taken a long break from the Gospel of Mark. The last time we were in it was back in June. And I'm actually thankful for the break, because the darkness and the grief that is in Mark 14 and the death of Jesus in Mark 15, it's really almost too much to go through consecutively in the life of a church. To preach through both chapters together, I think, would be difficult. And so I'm thankful for the break, because it lets us process in a way what we have seen so far in the Gospel of Mark. Mark is not a balanced gospel over the life of Jesus Christ. You know, John is a balanced gospel. John starts with the beginning of time in John 1:1, and then goes through all three of Jesus' visits to Jerusalem over all 3 years of his ministry, all the way to his death. It's very equally split. Matthew and Luke begin with, John the Baptist's birth and Jesus's birth, and then his childhood and his ministry, and it covers his whole teaching throughout his whole life. But not so Mark. If you remember, Mark chapter 1 begins with John baptizing Jesus Christ. 30 years into his life. And then you go really quickly for those first 3 years of ministry. Mark 2 is his teaching and authority and his confrontation with the Jewish religious leaders. Mark 3 is the Jewish leaders deciding to put him to death. Mark 4 and 5 is Jesus' power over the wind and the waves and death and sickness. And everything supernatural is in authority underneath Jesus Christ. Mark 6 and 7 is Jesus leaving Jerusalem, leaving Israel and going to other nations, preaching and coming back. Mark 8 and 9 is the transfiguration, Jesus saying he's going to go to Jerusalem to be killed. Mark 11, 12, and 13, that's the last week of his life. The last week of his life, those last few days in Jerusalem. Mark 14 then is the last night of his life. Mark 15, the last day of his life. In other words, most of Mark's gospel is this last week of his life. And it hurries to get there. Mark, the entire gospel, is running to the cross. As I said, Mark 14, we looked at this back in June, is the last night of Jesus' life. He'd been teaching all week long in the temple. He had brought the temple to a halt. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims had come to Jerusalem. They descend upon Jerusalem in this Passover week for the sacrifices in the temple, and Jesus stopped it all as he went to the temple and held court there. He taught, he arrived Sunday and then taught Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in the temple, bringing everything to a screeching halt. Thursday, he celebrates Passover with his disciples. Thursday night, he leaves and goes to a garden. He brings 3 of his disciples in the garden and he prays. And it's at that moment that substitution begins, that our sin is placed upon him. For the first time in his existence, the Son of God and God the Father have a separation between them. Not a separation in their being, but a separation in their relationship as sin begins to be placed upon the sinless Son of God. There's grief in the garden. There's prayer in the garden. There's crying out to God, and they're sleeping in the garden with the disciples. And then there's the police in the garden as the temple police come with their clubs and with the religious leaders, and they seize Jesus and they arrest him and they bring him to what becomes the first of 6 trials. There's 3 Jewish trials, 3 Gentile trials that are held about the fate of Jesus Christ. The first is with the high priest and his son-in-law, Annas and Caiaphas, who holds court over Jesus and ask him all these questions and decide that he's guilty. And for them, they didn't care about truth. They cared about one thing, money. They made their money from the temple, and Jesus had stopped everything in the temple, and that couldn't be. And so they had to deal with him by the Passover, which was Friday. Thursday night, they arrest him, and Annas and Caiaphas decide he's worthy of death. They hand him over to the second trial, the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is the council, if you look at Mark 15:1, which contains the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. 70 people in total sit on the Sanhedrin, and that's the trial that's described in the last part of Mark 14. There's all kinds of rules governing these trials. They weren't allowed to happen at night, for example. You couldn't be forced to testify against yourself. That the charges had to be submitted before the trial began. That you could cross-examine your witnesses. That the witnesses had to agree with one another or their testimony was invalid. That voting on the condemned's fate start with the least senior member and go to the most senior member through all 70 of them. That way the younger guys wouldn't be influenced by the votes of the older guys. That there had to be a full day between the trial and a death penalty verdict if it was a capital crime. There had to be a full day between the end of the trial, a day for prayer and fasting if you were going to vote to execute him. Then there had to be another full day for you to hear any new evidence that came forward. There's all these meticulous rules about the trials, and of course in Mark 14 we realize they broke every single one of them. They held it at night. They didn't have charges against him. They didn't let Jesus question his witnesses. They beat Jesus. They compelled him to testify against himself. They then voted starting with the chief priest who said there's no need for any more evidence. We must execute him. It started from the top and went its way down. But of course they couldn't pass the death penalty verdict at night, and that's where Mark 15 verse 1 comes in. The next morning, early in the morning, in other words, the first ray of light that crests the horizon, they immediately had another consultation. This is the third and final Jewish trial. They had just, fulfilled the last trial at probably 2 a.m, but they hung around these extra 3 hours because they couldn't vote to put him to death under darkness. Imagine just the really obscene nature. These are people that strain at gnats and swallow camels here. They had no problem executing an innocent man. They had no problem killing the sinless Son of God, but they wanted to follow the rule about court hours. There had to be one ray of light in the sky, and so they wait until 5 a.m, likely, to reconvene and do this third and final vote. Of course, they voted to execute him. There had been 3 hours, and they bind him and lead him away and deliver him to Pilate. As we go through the rest of this passage this morning, our outline will pretty much just look at the trial of Jesus. And the first step of this is to meet the accused. We meet the accused. They bind Jesus. They lead him away and deliver him to Pilate. They bound Jesus, of course, because he was tied up during the trial. They had beaten him. Remember, they blindfolded him and hit him and said, prophesy, tell us who hit you. But then Luke lets us know they threw him into the pit in Caiaphas' house, kind of in his cellar. You can go visit that today if you ever go to Jerusalem. It's still there. They threw him into the pit where he spent those next few hours when the Sanhedrin reconvened again. They then fished him back out, tied him up, rebound him again, and led him away. This must have been quite an entourage going through the streets of Jerusalem. The 70 members of the Sanhedrin were there, the temple police were there, and then Jesus bound in the middle of them, winding their way through the streets of Jerusalem at 5 a.m. It's probably a quarter mile from Caiaphas' house to the place, the tower, guard tower where Pilate was staying, and they cover that distance at 5 a.m. Nobody's awake. The whole town is quiet. It's the beginning of Passover. That day is Passover, and they make their way through with this entourage to the man Pilate. Now, it's really critical to know about Pilate to understand the fullness of what's happening in this passage here. Pilate was the governor of Jerusalem, but not just Jerusalem. Israel is an ethnic nation. Israel, as it is today, it has geographic borders. It has the same ethnicity, same language, same religion, same culture that unites this country together. And Rome, when Rome occupied Israel, had given them one king to rule over the entire nation. But before Jesus was born, that king led a rebellion against Rome. And so Rome, Caesar, responded by splitting Israel in half politically. So it was one nation by ethnicity and language and religion and culture, but Rome had divided it in half and gave each half its own governor. There was Herod the Great, who was ruling over the north, Galilee and the Lake of Galilee where Jesus had grown up. But the southern part, Jerusalem, was carved out of that. So Jerusalem and Judea, the desert all the way down to Egypt, that had its own governor that was different than Herod. And that governor also had a strip of land that went up the Mediterranean coast into Lebanon and then into Syria. So that governor had this like crescent shape that went around. And in the middle of that was where Herod reigned in Galilee. In other words, Rome divided up Israel so there wasn't one leader over both parts. You know, an American analogy might be the fact that you can have in a state 2 senators, and each senator might oversee a geographic region of the state. And they could be from different parties even. They could be from two totally different parties. They represent the state of course, the state as a whole, but they're from different parties. They may not even like each other. They may be enemies with each other, but the state falls under their jurisdiction. What Caesar had done with Israel was given a geographic dividing line. Jerusalem in south belonged to the governor. North of Jerusalem, Galilee, all belonged to King Herod. Now, what this governor did was he wasn't Jewish. He didn't want to be around Jerusalem, so he moved the capital to Caesarea Maritime. It's along the Mediterranean coast. It's modern-day Tel Aviv. It's just north of that. It happens to be the most beautiful place in Israel, by the way. I'm sure there were geographic reasons he moved there, and it wasn't just for the view. It was actually the highway that goes from Lebanon down to Jerusalem. This is about the halfway point on that highway, and so that's why he moved the capital there. But it also played into it that he didn't like Jewish people. He didn't like their culture, speak their language. He had antagonism towards them, so he moved his headquarters there. Well, Pilate becomes the fifth of these governors. So Pilate is the governor that oversees Jerusalem, the southern half of Israel, the Mediterranean coast of Israel, up into Lebanon and Syria. And Pilate kept his headquarters at Caesarea Maritime, this beautiful, incredible place overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. Pilate did not like Jews. He wasn't Jewish. He didn't get along with Jews. In fact, his first act as king was to descend upon Jerusalem with his own Roman army, flying these Roman flags with these massive eagles on them that the Jews thought was idolatry. The Jews hated those flags in Jerusalem and wouldn't let Pilate and his soldiers enter the city. In fact, they chased Pilate and his soldiers out of their city. So week one on the job, the governor gets chased out of Jerusalem. He flees and goes north up to Herod's territory, and it's no longer Herod the Great, but one of his nephews who's King Herod there now. This would be the Herod that executed John the Baptist. Pilate flees there for refuge. He makes it all the way to Bethshan, where he enters modern-day Bethshan, where he enters in this auditorium, and all those who are chasing him file into the auditorium as well. And then Pilate has his soldiers circle the auditorium and trap everybody who's chasing him inside. And Pilate tells the Jews, you need to stop. You need to allow me to fly these flags in Jerusalem, or I will cut off your heads right here and right now. Well, historians tell us that the Jews called Pilate's bluff. They took off their shirts, they held out their heads and said, me first, start with me. Pilate did not want to start his first week as governor of Jerusalem by executing all of the Jewish leaders. And Herod, King Herod, didn't bail him out, didn't come help him. So Pilate was forced to equivocate and took down the flags and told him he wouldn't fly the flags in Jerusalem. That was Pilate's introduction to being the governor of Jerusalem. He learned other lessons like this. For example, he put up coats of arms inside his hall, the hall that he stayed when he was in Jerusalem. And the Jews hated that too. They thought the coats of arms were another form of idolatry. They didn't want that in a building that was adjacent to the temple. They hated it, and they wanted to rebel against that. And Pilate, he stood his ground this time. King Herod from Galilee had to rebuke Pilate and say, don't antagonize the Jews. We both rule over them. Why do you keep antagonizing them? Stop it. And so Pilate and Herod had this antagonism. They were rivals with each other. They didn't like each other either. Pilate was very isolated. Another example of Pilate that helps you understand what kind of person he is, he wanted to build an aqueduct to bring water into Jerusalem. But he didn't want to ask Caesar for money to do it. He didn't want to raise the taxes because the Jews were already overly taxed. So instead, he sent his soldiers into the temple, and they stole money from the temple treasury to build the aqueduct. And Pilate justified it, saying it's aqueduct for Jerusalem. The money in the temple is from the Jews. So there, what's wrong with this? And the Jews held their ground, and the Pharisees and the temple leaders, they fought back, and Pilate's soldiers slaughtered their priests. They took the blood of the priests and then took the sacrifices, and they mixed the blood together, so the blood of the animals and the blood of the priests ran together, flowing out of the temple. This is described by Jesus in, I believe, Luke 18 is where Jesus describes that slaughter. This is Pilate. Pilate hates the Jews and the Jewish leaders. The Jewish leaders hate Pilate. They don't get along. They don't partner with anything. They are rivals. They can't stand each other. Their last interaction was when Pilate invaded the temple and slaughtered the priests. Pilate is totally content to live on the Mediterranean coast and stay away from Jerusalem, except for 1 week a year. 1 week a year, Pilate comes to Jerusalem. When all of the Jews from everywhere descend upon the city in Passover week, Pilate goes there also. He wants to present himself before all of the Jews as their governor because Jerusalem falls under his jurisdiction. This is what kind of man Pilate is. And this is where we find ourselves in Mark 15, verse 1. The Jews bind Jesus and lead him to Pilate at 5 a.m. I'll guarantee you that Pilate was not expecting this. The Pharisees would never go ask Pilate for anything, ever. The Jewish leaders would have nothing to do with Pilate. They can't stand him, much less at 5 a.m. on Passover. This is the Passover Friday. And they rattled the gate. Pilate, when he was in Jerusalem, stayed in this guard tower, and they went there and rattled the gate and rousted him up and deliver him Jesus. Pilate knows who Jesus is, of course. Pilate goes to Jerusalem 1 week a year. Jesus is in Jerusalem that same week and brought everything in the temple to a halt. Pilate has been governor now 13 years. He's never seen a Passover like this. Everything in the city is different, and it's all because of Jesus Christ. And Pilate knows that. He was not expecting to open up the gate in the morning and see Jesus there. Well, Pilate brings Jesus inside. This is described in the other Gospels. The soldiers and the Sanhedrin refuse to go inside the guard hall. They don't want to go in because they don't want to defile the temple. And so leave your finger in Mark 15 and flip over to John chapter 18. John chapter 18. We're going to bounce back and forth between these two verses, these two books. So have Bible dexterity here. Remember the sword drills from the old days? Bible dexterity. Over to John 18, beginning in verse, well, you can begin in verse 28 of John 18. They led Jesus from Caiaphas, the house, the hole where he was in over the night, to the praetorium. That's the hall, the coat of arms place where Pilate stayed. It was early. It was 5 a.m. We know from Mark, the first time the light crested the horizon. They themselves didn't enter the praetorium because they didn't want to defile themselves because it was Passover. So the whole Sanhedrin, they wouldn't step foot in this hall because it was the Passover and the hall had these idols in it and they didn't want to be declared unclean. So they made Pilate go out to him. Verse 29, so Pilate went out to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? When you combine all the Gospels, you realize that Pilate had Jesus brought inside by this point. So now he's outside again after Jesus had come inside, asking them, what exactly are you accusing him of? What am I supposed to find out here? Verse 30, they answered him and said, if this man were not an evildoer, we wouldn't have delivered him to you. How do you like that logic? Would that work in a court? The judge turns to the prosecutor and says, so what are the charges? And the prosecutor says, Your Honor, I've been a prosecutor for a long time. I mean, let's not waste each other's time here. I wouldn't bring somebody to court unless they were guilty. So let's just go ahead and find him guilty and be done with this. I mean, who needs a trial and evidence and a jury and all that? I mean, obviously he's guilty or I wouldn't be here. I don't think the judge is going to go for that. But that's their attempt with Pilate here. Like, Pilate, we're here. He's guilty. Deal with him. There's no formalities here. There's no etiquette here. This has not been done before. The Sanhedrin has never gone to Pilate's door to ask him for something like this ever before. This is the first time either of them are going through this. They don't know what they're supposed to do. Pilate says, what are the charges? And the Sanhedrin says, you got to be kidding me. We brought him to you. Of course he's guilty. Of course he's guilty. So Pilate, verse 31 says, take him yourselves, and you judge him according to your law. The Jews said to him, we're not permitted to put anyone to death. Now, why did the Jews bring Jesus to Pilate? I mean, that's the question here. Why didn't they just kill Jesus themselves? Well, John points out that the Jews weren't permitted to do that. They didn't have the legal right to do that. But listen, that has never stopped them before. They have no problem executing people. They tried to kill Jesus already in Luke chapter 4, remember? They tried to throw him off of a cliff 3 years ago. This has nothing to do with Roman law. They have no problem stoning Stephen to death in the book of Acts. They don't need to go get the governor's approval. They throw rocks at him until he's dead. They don't care if the governor signs off of it, and they definitely don't care if Pilate approves of whether or not they execute Jesus Christ. The reason they're there at Pilate's door is because the Jewish leaders, they don't want to be blamed for this. They are terrified of the crowd. Mark lets you know that over and over and over again. They are terrified of the crowd. And listen, the crowd went to sleep last night. When their heads hit their pillows, Jesus was alive and well. When they wake up on Friday morning, if they find out that the Sanhedrin executed Jesus in the middle of the night, they're going to have a revolution in their hand. The Sanhedrin and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, their religious leadership will be over if they kill Jesus in the middle of the night. They can't just take him to the gate and throw rocks at him either. In fact, that's what Pilate suggests. He says, why don't you judge him according to your law? Well, their law allows them to kill somebody. Their law allows them to stone someone to death for blasphemy. That's what their law allows. So Pilate is telling them, if you want to deal with Jesus, you deal with him. If you want to kill him, go for it. Go kill him. Don't drag me into this. And they say, no, we're not allowed to crucify him. That's their point. They want him crucified because that's a public death, raised up on a cross so everybody will see. And if Pilate crucifies him, the Jews won't rebel against the religious leaders. The Jews already hate Pilate. They're not going to hate him more. And the Sanhedrin will emerge unscathed from this. Maybe nobody will know it was them that delivered Jesus to Pilate. After all, it's 5 a.m. People will wake up, and Jesus, by the way, is going to be on the cross by 9 a.m. By the time the world gets to life here, Jesus is already on the cross. That's their goal. Well, it's also to fulfill prophecy. It is also to fulfill prophecy. And John points that out. Verse 32, this was to fulfill the word of Jesus, which he spoke, signifying what kind of death he was about to die. Back in John chapter 3 and John 12, Jesus said that he would be lifted up. Like Moses lifted up the serpent on the stake in the wilderness, so Jesus was going to be lifted up. His body was physically going to be raised on a cross overlooking Jerusalem. It was going to be evident to all that he was lifted up in judgment and in sacrifice for the Israelites. That's why this is happening. It's the Jews trying to get out of being blamed for this, and it's God fulfilling his prophecy. Both are happening, and that's why they're at Pilate's doorstep. You can flip back to Mark 15 from there. This is the accused. What we're going to see next is the trial. The trial. And we'll skip jumping around here, but in Luke 22, it's filled in that they tell Pilate, they're accusing him of 3 things. John leaves that out, Mark leaves that out, but Luke fills us in here and says they give him 3 charges. They tell Pilate that he's guilty of 3 things. First of all, for advocating overthrowing Rome. Second of all, for advocating not paying taxes to Caesar. And thirdly, for claiming that he's a king. Well, Pilate doesn't believe the first 2. They don't believe that Jesus is trying to overthrow Rome. In fact, Jews had often told Jesus, let's go overthrow Rome, and Jesus said no. So that's not what his goal is, and Pilate knows that. Secondly, they accuse him of refusing to pay taxes to Caesar, teaching others not to pay taxes. Is that true? Of course not. It was Monday in the temple, and they asked him, should you pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus says, render to Caesar that which is Caesar's. He told them, yes, pay taxes to Caesar, but they didn't care about his actual answer. It's amazing that on Monday he says pay taxes to Caesar, and on Friday morning they're saying, he tells us not to pay taxes to you. They're just straight up lying to Pilate. And Pilate knew it was a lie too. I bet he had messengers there at the temple. This wasn't happening in a closet somewhere. This was in the most public place in Jerusalem where he is asked in front of everybody, should you pay taxes to Caesar? And he says, yes, you can guarantee Pilate is in the next building over that messengers came and told him what Jesus said. Pilate doesn't believe their lies for a second. But the third charge, that he's a king, that one gets Pilate's attention. Suddenly, Pilate is very interested in this. Pilate knows the story of Jesus' birth. He knows that when Herod the Great heard that the King of Jews was born into Galilee, he slaughtered an entire generation of Jews to root out that king, and he failed. Is this the man that is now in his courtyard? Does he have the King of the Jews that Herod was after? Is that the man who's in front of him? That is interesting to Pilate. And so that's why in Mark 15, verse 2, Pilate questions him. Remember, all the leaders are outside. Jesus is inside, and he asks him, are you the king of the Jews? The word you is emphatic there. It's not needed in the Greek. It's second person singular. It's obvious from the verb, but it's added by Pilate to make it almost drip with sarcasm. It's almost as if, in English you would say, are you really you, the king of the Jews? It's as if, you've got to be kidding me, right? What is this, a joke? What does Jesus look like right now? He's been awake all night long. He's been beaten. His clothes are bloodstained. Remember, they bound him and blindfolded and hit him and said, prophesy and tell us who's hitting him. He's been spit on. They spit all over him. He hasn't been cleansed. Here's this man who's covered in spit and blood, and he's beaten and he's haggard and he's exhausted. He's the one who's standing before Pilate. So when Pilate says, are you a king? Read into that. Really? This is the King of the Jews. Why would they even say that? And Jesus' answer is amazing. He says, it is as you say. It's a very interesting way of answering it. He's not saying yes. He's not saying no. He's saying what you say. What you mean by that, Pilate? What does that mean? Well, you have to flip back over to John 18 to get what that means. The full answer here. John 18, verse 33 is where we pick this up again. Therefore, Pilate entered the praetorium, and he summoned Jesus and said, are you the King of the Jews? That's the question we just read in Mark's gospel. Jesus answered, are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you this about me? In other words, are you asking me if I'm king because you care if I'm king, Pilate? Are you asking me if I'm king because the Sanhedrin says that I'm king? Which way? Because there's two different meanings to the word king here. It's this one word being used two ways. One way is the civic king of national Israel. Is Jesus saying that he is the real king of Israel? There should be no Pilate. There should be no Herod. It should be Jesus instead. That's what Pilate is interested in. That's what Pilate is asking. That's not what the Sanhedrin is asking. The Sanhedrin says that he's claiming that he is the Messiah, the King of David, from the line of David, who reigns on the throne. The Davidic promise in 2 Samuel chapter 7, David is that founder of that promise, and Jesus is that king. That's what the Sanhedrin is saying. So that's Jesus' question. Pilate, are you asking me if I should be wearing your crown, or are you asking me if I'm wearing the crown of David? Are you asking me if I am the king sent by Caesar to rule over Israel, or are you asking me if I am the king promised to the Jews? Which way are we going to argue this? Are you asking because you want to know, or are you asking because the Jewish leaders told you this? Well, Pilate obviously understands what Jesus means by that, because look at how he answers, verse 35. I'm not a Jew, am I? Your nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. In other words, Pilate is saying, I don't care if you're from the line of David. I don't care if they say you're the Messiah. That doesn't interest me at all. I don't care if you're a real Messiah. I don't care if you're a false Messiah, a big Messiah, a small Messiah. Messiah Shesmaya is what he says. Who cares? I'm not a Jew. Why are you bothering me with messiahship? What have you done? Let's cut through the chase, Jesus. Why are you here? That's a brilliant question, isn't it? Let's get rid of the charges. Let's get right to the chase. Pilate, he's a political genius. It doesn't practically play out often in his life, but why are you here? Verse 36. Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. Notice how he's telling Pilate a little bit, you don't need to worry about me. I'm not after you, Pilate. My kingdom's not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. He's almost like he's telling Pilate, listen, Pilate, put your hand to your ear. Listen at the door. Do you hear my soldiers coming? Do you hear Peter with his sword trying to break in the door and rescue me? Where's Judas right now? Where's John? Where's Thomas? Where's my army, Jesus is saying. If you thought I was a king from this world, then I would have an army fighting for me. And this is not a veiled threat. Jesus all week long had over 100,000 people hanging on every word he was saying from the temple steps. If he wanted to overthrow Rome, he would have done that Monday. He's not trying to overthrow Rome. As it is now, it's 5 a.m, and there is nobody there to defend Jesus. Pilate has his own soldiers at his side all the time. If Jesus were that kind of king, there might be one person there trying to get him. At least that's Jesus' point here. My kingdom is not of the realm that you're a king in, Pilate. So Pilate said to him, Verse 37, so you are a king then. You say your kingdom's not of this realm. That means you are a king, right? And Jesus answered him, you say correctly that I'm a king. That's his answer from the Gospel of Mark when he says, it's just as you said. That's this line here. It's just as you're saying, Pilate. What Pilate means by that, you're not a king in the political world, but you are a spiritual king. And Jesus says, that's right. It's just like you're saying, Pilate. Pilate gets it. And Jesus understands that. You say correctly, I'm a king, verse 37. For this I was born, for this I've come into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone, whether your name is Pilate or Annas, it doesn't matter if you're a king or a spiritual leader, everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. That's the challenge to Pilate right there. I'm not talking about your governorship, Pilate. I'm talking about, do you know the truth? Because everyone who knows the truth hears my voice. Well, Pilate's interest in this has been exhausted. Verse 38. He shrugs his shoulders. He says, what is truth? This is postmodernism 2,000 years ago. What is truth? Who cares about truth? Pilate doesn't care about truth. The implication here, and this is not the kind of judge you want deciding your fate. Truth? That's too hard. So that leads to the appeal, verse 38. When he had said this, he went out again to the Jews, and he said to them, I find no guilt in him. You can flip back over to Mark 15. I find no guilt in him. Verse 3, the chief priests began to accuse him harshly. Pilate brings Jesus outside and says, not guilty. We get that from John. And at that moment, all the priests start to accuse Jesus harshly. The whole crowd, 70 of them, start hurling insults at him, start calling him all kinds of things. They accuse him very stringently, harshly, violently even. And Pilate questions Jesus now. Don't you answer? Jesus is just sitting there in silence. And Pilate says, why are you quiet? Defend yourself. But Jesus doesn't say anything. Why doesn't Jesus respond? Because Pilate has already declared his innocence. Jesus' silence is a direct confrontation to Pilate. Pilate is hoping Jesus will argue his way out of this. Jesus is not helping Pilate out at all here. Pilate declares he's innocent. The scribes and the Sanhedrin revolt and start hurling all these accusations against him, and Jesus just stands there in silence. Pilate says, answer, and Jesus looks at Pilate as if to say, you gave your verdict. Does your verdict not stand? Can Pilate not carry out his verdict in the face of opposition to the Sanhedrin? Who's stronger here, the Sanhedrin or Pilate? Don't push this on Jesus. Pilate needs to man up and enact his verdict and say, let him go, he's innocent. Jesus is going to remain quiet and let Pilate do his job. Pilate is boxed in. He's boxed in, and this is where the appeal comes in. You really need to see what Luke says about this to bring the full picture together. So flip over to the Gospel of Luke. Luke 23, verse 4 is where we'll start. Luke 23. This is this point in the trial here. At this point in the proceedings, Pilate has brought Jesus outside and says he's innocent. There's no fault in him. You see that in verse 4. Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. That's exactly what is recorded in John 18:38. I find no guilt in him. But this is Luke 23, verse 5. They kept on insisting, saying he stirs up the people. This is what was quoted in Mark 15, verse 4, they keep accusing him harshly. He stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place. And suddenly Pilate hears a new word. He hadn't heard this yet. Verse 6, when Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And they say he is. When he learned of that, he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction. Aha. You can almost see the light bulb go on above Pilate's head, right? Nah, this is my way out. Now, Herod is not over Jerusalem, but Herod is in Jerusalem for Passover because Herod is also a Jew. In fact, Herod's right around the corner. Herod had his own little palace he stayed in when he came to Jerusalem. So let's transfer Jesus over there. This is the appeal. Let's bring in the Galilean king and see what he has to say about this. Do you see how Pilate is fishing for a way out here? Maybe Herod will condemn him. If Herod puts him to death, Pilate is in the clear. Maybe Herod will let him go. After all, Herod's a Jew. He's way better equipped to wade through this than Pilate is. So transfer him over there. And I mean, I don't know if this is true or not, but I can picture a nod and a wink here from Pilate. Send him over to Herod. And hey, if anything were to happen to him on the way, I don't need to be any the wiser. You could lose him. He could escape. You could accidentally kill him. There could be a carriage crash and problem solved. But Jesus does make it over to Herod. And that's because the Jewish leaders, they don't just want to kill Jesus. They want to make sure that it's the Romans that do it. But they bring him over there. And this is where we kick in verse 8, Luke 23, verse 8. Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he'd wanted to see him for a long time because he'd been hearing about him, was hoping to see some sign performed by him. Herod has a vested interest in Jesus. Herod is the king who oversees Galilee. This is the Herod who cut off John the Baptist's head when John the Baptist rebuked him for his illicit incestuous marriage. He had John the Baptist beheaded. Do you remember that? And then Jesus' teaching rose up and Jesus became more and more popular than even John was. And people came to Herod and said, what's going on with this Jesus guy? And you remember what Herod's guess was? Herod thought that Jesus was John the Baptist resurrected. Well, now he's got Jesus in front of him, so it's not John. I mean, he held John's head. He's looking at Jesus. They're not the same person. You can cross that off the list of possibilities. Jesus is not John. Beyond that, Herod wanted to see some miracles by Jesus. It was the circus was in town, and Herod wanted a front row seat. That was his attitude towards this. And Herod had been trying to kill Jesus for a while. Even when Jesus was up in Galilee, do you remember? His disciples told him, you've got to get out of Galilee because Herod is coming to kill you. Jesus' response was classic. He said, that fox Herod, let him bring it. That's my own translation of that. Bring it, Herod. Jesus told his disciples, Herod's not going to kill me. He's a fox. And I mean, for us, foxes are cute, but rats are ugly. So you can just switch it. Jesus is calling him a fox. For the Jews, foxes were like our rats. Herod's a rat. He's not going to kill me. And then Jesus did not follow with a helpful answer. He said, Herod's not going to kill me, but I will flee Galilee. Instead, I'm going to run to Jerusalem, and there I will be executed by being crucified on a cross. So for everybody telling him, flee Galilee to spare your life, that was not the answer they were looking for. But now Herod has Jesus. He wants to see some tricks. Verse 9, he questioned him at some length, but Jesus answered him nothing. Jesus didn't say a word to Herod. He's not a circus animal. He's not going to perform. He's just silent. And he's not dodging here. I think some people have wrongly understood that Jesus is dodging. Whenever anybody has asked him a real question during any of his trials, he's given a real answer, right? When they asked him, are you king? He answered. When they asked him, are you the Messiah? He answered. When they asked him, are you the Son of God? He answered. He answers all the questions that are real questions given to him. But he's not just vainly defending himself. Verse 10, the chief priests and the scribes were all standing there. I mean, Herod does this in front of the whole Sanhedrin, and they were accusing him strongly. Verse 11, and Herod with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, this is where they beat him, they put the crown of thorns on his head, and then here they dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Pilate sent Jesus to Herod saying, this guy's the king of the Jews. It's a joke. And so Pilate receives Jesus back. This time he's wearing a kingly robe. Herod dressed him up like a king and sent him back. It's a joke to Pilate. And we know that because verse 12, now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day. Herod and Pilate had been enemies. Herod is the one who told Pilate, get rid of those arms from your hall. Herod is the one that refused to defend Pilate when Pilate had to flee Jerusalem. Herod and Pilate do not get along. They have been enemies their entire careers. But now, suddenly they're united because neither of them know what to do with Jesus. So he gets shipped back and they become friends. You can flip back to Mark 15. Jesus returns. And this leads to our verdict, the verdict for the trial. Verse 5. Mark 15, Jesus made no further answer. So Pilate was amazed. Pilate was amazed. Pilate is condemned here as guilty. I hope you realize as you look at the outline here, it's not Jesus who's on trial. It's Pilate who's on trial. Pilate is the one who stands accused before Jesus Christ here. He is the one who has been called into account. He's looking his maker into the eyes as Jesus and Pilate look face to face with each other, and Pilate will have to answer for if he loves truth or if he loves himself. Pilate had access to all the information that was there. He asked Jesus all the questions he wanted to ask. He received incredibly good answers. The final answer being Jesus telling Pilate, everyone, Jew or Gentile, everyone who loves truth knows Jesus' voice. And Pilate failed the test. He shrugged his shoulders and said, I don't care about truth. Pilate appealed the case, of course, and sent it to Herod, who bounced it right back to him. You can't push off your decision about Jesus Christ. You cannot push off your judgment about Jesus to somebody else. And I hope you see that you are all in Pilate's shoes as well. You are all on trial before Jesus Christ also. You have to make a decision. Are you going to love truth and love Jesus Christ? Or are you going to reject him? And if you reject him, you are declared guilty before God. You can appeal to somebody else, it's not going to help. Nobody else gets to make your decision about Jesus for you. Doesn't matter what your husband or your wife thinks about Jesus. It doesn't matter what your parents think about Jesus. It only matters what you do with him. Pilate gets this trial played out in the flesh in this life. Pilate, in his physical life, looks Jesus in the eye, and they have this encounter. Jesus stands as his judge in this life. This is just a little picture of what it will be like in the next life for all of us. When you die, it's appointed to man once to die, and then the judgment. When you die, you will stand face to face before Jesus Christ, and he will be your judge. How will he find you? If you plead that you're guilty in this life, then Jesus here, he takes your guilty verdict for you. Here in his life, here back in Mark 15. If you confess that you're a sinner, Jesus takes your sin. If you confess that you're guilty and you deserve death, you deserve separation from God, Jesus takes your sin, he takes your death, he takes your punishment, he takes your separation from God. He goes to the cross in your place, right here. But if you shrug your shoulders and you say, what is truth? Then you stand guilty. You will take your own guilt, you will take your own punishment from God, and you will be separated from God. If you confess your sin to Jesus now, he's your judge, and he becomes your substitute. But if you deny your guilt before Jesus now, you have no substitute, and he is your judge. He will convict you, he will condemn you. There's all kinds of responses that are not appropriate. You can shrug your shoulders and say, I can't tell what truth is. I'm not equipped for this. Maybe somebody else who knows more about the Bible, they could give a better answer. You could even be amazed. You could even be amazed. You can cover your mouth and gasp about how profound Jesus is. That's what Pilate does in verse 5. He stands amazed at Jesus. But he never kneels as Jesus' subject. Jesus wasn't after Pilate's scepter. He wasn't after his governorship. Jesus is after Pilate's heart. And the same is true with you. Will you give your heart to the Lord? If you do that, he'll stop being your judge and he'll become your advocate.